Welcome back to Cards and Comics, and today I'm going to be looking at Topps Vintage All-Star cards and why have their values shot up so high in the last 6 to 8 months. And I'm going to be looking at the Vintage All-Star cards from the 50s and 60s, and I'll be looking to see if there's any trends or any reason why we can think of as to why these previously kind of low-cost Hall of Fame cards have really taken off in value. So what I'm going to be looking at is cards from the first period of Topps All-Star card designs, and these are the ones with unique designs. Some of the older hobby publications call these the magazine years because you'll see that Sport Magazine or Sporty News was how the All-Star cards got their selection of players by looking at the magazine selection. So this wasn't all the time the All-Stars who actually played in the game, right? And so from 1958 through 1962, which is a 5-year run, they had a unique design, and every year contained a mantle, a maze, or an Aaron card. So you had three of the biggest Hall of Famers right in a row. Now, some years there was Ted Williams, some years there was Stan Musial, Ernie Banks, but the three of the biggest Hall of Famers were in every set, which was Mantle, Mays, and Aaron. Now, conversely, there was no Clemente cards from 1958 through 62, which is kind of a travesty, in my opinion, because he was definitely an all-star caliber player, especially in 61 and 62. Now, the second period, 68 through 70, there is an Aaron card, but no Mays or Mano cards, and there's only one All-Star card of Clemente in 68. So we're not going to look at those years because what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at these as both individual players and as a collective. I'm going to use the three players, Mantle, Mays, and Aaron, to kind of do an aggregate for the entire All-Star card set by looking at the three most popular Hall of Famers, or three of the most popular Hall of Famers from those years, and kind of use their pricing to kind of aggregate the entire, All-Star card run. And, these are three of the most highly collected, important players anyway. Then I'm going to look at them individually to see if there's a real difference between looking at it as a group and as an individual player. I'm going to look only at PSA 8. And that's because that's the price that's really gone up in value. Also, a lot of sales are in the 8. So a lot of movement is in that grade compared to some other grades. And I'm going to look at pop counts and total cards submitted by year to see if some of these cards are just low pops or if they're just hard to find or just not a lot have been submitted. So we're going to look at it in totality and come up with some theories and some analysis here to explain why things are going up so much. So let's look at the raw data. So in general, you can see that, starting in 1958, that some of these cards in 2020, which was, again, the big boost in sales, and again, I'm looking year over year, so I'm starting in April of 2020, and that's after some of the first big price spikes hit for a lot of Hall of Fame cards and cards in general, right? So April 2020, we already had our first spike. And you can see these cards were largely unaffected in April of 2020. The Willie Mays card in 1958 was $150. And it was even cheaper than the Hank Aaron. And that's very interesting considering what I'm going to show you about pop count later on. But you can see from 2020 to 2022, that Willie Mays card went from $150 to $2,400, which is why I'm talking about it, because if it wasn't such a dramatic and glaring price difference, I wouldn't have really thought too much about it because a lot of cards have gone up in value, right? And you can even see that the card bypassed Mickey Mantle in terms of value in 2021. And there's very, very few. In fact, no other All-Star card year has a Mays or Mantle that is higher. A Mays or Aaron higher than the Mantle. So the 58 is doing something very unusual, which is being higher price than the Mantle. Now, we'll look at different years and get some idea around pop count and just in general trend. But the cards highlighted in yellow are cards that have not sold in 2022 yet. That's pretty key for one of these cards coming up. But I look at that mantle thinking 1120 for December 2021 versus April or May 2022. I think that card would sell more than $1,100. I don't think it would bring the $2,400 that the Maze is bringing because of pop count. We'll get into that later. So let's look at some things, some combined values, right? So if you take all three players and combine them on average, you'll see that on average in 1958, the card price was $280 on average. But going into 2022, it's $1,800 on average. And you can see a lot of that's being driven by the Maze card, but still, that's a ginormous price increase from 2020 to 2022. Now, comparatively, all the other cards in years are very similar price. So you can see the spread from 2020 to 21 to 22 on average value for the three cards is very similar. Look at 2020, 420 for the 59 to 340 for the 61. Sorry, 62. I got a mislabel there. But you can see that is a pretty flat curve, right? And then you look at 2021, 679 to 740, but you got 3 years there, okay? 59, 61, and 62, where there's a $3 difference in the average price for all three players combined. That is pretty incredible in terms of consistency. And even when you get into 2022, the spread is only around $50 between all three cards. So you can see every other year of All-Star cards, the spread and the average gain is pretty consistent amongst all years except for 58. Now, if you look at dollar increase, just in terms of percentage increase, you can see that trend, and you can see that the 58 set from 2020 to 21 went up 188%, and then 21 to 22, another 133%. So it was more than doubling and almost tripling in value the first year that I look at. In the second year, it's gone up, well over, double the amount, 133%. Now, no other year had 2 consecutive years of growth like that. You had, that kind of doubling or almost doubling in 2020. Again, that's all cards, right? All cards were going up to a certain extent. We saw doubling and quadrupling of certain cards in that time period, vintage or even modern, right? So this doesn't surprise me. And then you can see the 2020 to 21 kind of leveling off and cooling of all cards. So on average between 2021 and 22, the average gain was around 22% for all cards other than the 58. And it's very consistent, right? And I think that shows you that in reality, this huge price increase in cards is really isolated to the 58 set. And so it's really, you can say, yes, these All-Star cards are worth a lot more than they were in 2020 or pre-2020. But, I don't think they would be out of line if you just do the same graph for just Hall of Fame cards or league leader cards or other cards that have gone up in value too. However, the 58 set has gone up enormously comparatively. So I'll talk about some reasons why and some other factors that we can think about. And then when you start looking at the players themselves, so when you think about you take the aggregate, all three players combined, and you break it down into individual players, you can see the Mantle went up from $600 to $1,400 on average, while the Maze went from $200 to $900. So again, the Maze more than quadrupled in value, okay, between 2020 and 2022, whereas the Mantle just went a little bit more than double. So the Maze was outperforming the Aaron by 2x during this time period. If you just had all of those, All-Star cards and a PSA 8, you would have quadrupled your value if you'd had them in 2020 versus 2022. you would have only doubled your money if you had Mantles. Now, Hank Aaron went up close to quadruple, a little bit lower than the Mays, but was doing very well. But I think the big key there was in 2020, Hank Aaron was actually worth more than the Mays on average. If you take all the cards from 1958 to 62, so all 5 years. Now, if you look at year over year gain, you'll just see that number, is very striking, is that, obviously in 2020, the Mays made the biggest jump, but it consistently still outperformed both Mantle and Aaron in 21 and 21 to 22 by pretty significant factors. And I would say both the Aaron and the Mays really outperformed the Mantle, and you can see the Mantle really, his cards have kind of cooled off a little bit because they were already pretty pricey. And if you go back to my original Willie Mays video, I think I was saying that I felt Mays cards were going to quadruple in value from 2020 to 2022. That was sort of like my initial thought, was that Mays cards are going to quadruple in value in just in general terms, because of how the prices were going and just how much lower he was in value compared to Mantle or even Aaron. And so he had a lot of runway to make up, but he also was a much better player, right? So I think that is something that is hard to over or underemphasize, is that, Willie Mays is finally getting his due. And so this price correction is kind of a long time in coming. And you can just see that certain cards have really triggered the collector to go out and really seek the cards, right? And I think that is one of the other key factors. So, but if you look at pop count, so I think this is something that I don't, think people look at too critically, with vintage cards, because they kind of all seem like they're low pop count. But in the PSA 8 realm, anything below 200 is pretty, is in the rare category. And you can see right off the bat that 58 Mays has significantly less PSA 8s than any other year of All-Star card from 58 through 62. And that is one of the big driving factors of this price correction. Now, the Aaron has also gone up quite significant, over $2,000, right? Now, it's gone up, half as much from 2020 to 2022 as the Mays in terms of percentage gain, but still 751%, still quite significant, compared to the Mantle and to any other year of All-Star card growth. So, I think that sub 200 is fairly significant in terms of pop count. However, there's another card on this list, the 62 Aaron, that's the second lowest. And you can see it only increased in value by 74% from 2020 to 2022, which is actually much, much below what an average Hall of Famer went up, especially a Mays or Aaron or Mantle card during that time period. In fact, it's the lowest gain of any card on the list, but it's the second lowest pop. That makes not a lot of sense. However, if you go to my original first page, there hasn't been a 62 Aaron 8 sold in 2022 yet. So there is a caveat there that this card is yet to be sold in 2022. I think when one finally comes to auction, it's going to bring a really significant price increase versus what it sold in December of 21. So in general, if you look at this list, it kind of explains, especially when you look at total cards graded, because sometimes you can look at total cards graded as being like, well, maybe the card just hasn't been submitted as much. Now, Mickey Mantle always has the most cards submitted of any card in any set. And this bears itself out in every set he's in, right? You look at that 58, and you can see that there's been 8,058 Mantles submitted, 4 times as many as Mays, and 3.5 times as many Aarons as Aaron's been submitted. But 1,900 Willie Mays cards seems like it's low compared to Mantle. But if you look at the 1,900 compared to other years, it's not the lowest amount. And in fact, in some years, it's a lot higher. So, if you think about the 61 Mays, which only 1,356 have been submitted in totality, compared, 600 less than the 58. However, there's 166 more PSA 8s, more than double. Okay, than they are, 61 Maze 8s versus 58. So that to me shows that the 58 Maze is a hard card to grade. Even if you can find it, it's not going to grade an 8 very easily. It's going to continue to be a low pop. And here's another thing to consider when we're looking at these kind of cards, is that PSA is very aware of its pop counts. And it protects the really low pop count cards by making the cards harder to get those grades. And I know people have I've had a few conversations with other collectors and who kind of want to say like, no, PSA doesn't care, But look at Jeter cards and Griffey cards, the rookies, they protect the 10s. And I do think that they're protecting this 58 Maze All-Star PSA 8 because it's gone to $2,400. It's a low pop from a set that has a lot of low pops, but the All-Star cards have always been kind of not the low pops. In fact, this card was pretty cheap in 2020, $150, compared to $2,400 now. So this is one of those cards that self-corrected because of the pop count. Because people who collect Maze cards, people who are in this, let's say, who are investors in vintage cards, seek out these low pop cards to invest in. And that's why you see a run up sometimes, because the investors and the collectors are all running to go get these low pop cards, and they run into each other and the prices go up. And so I think the cat's kind of out of the bag on some of these cards now in terms of low pop. If you'd have asked me in 2020 if the 58 Maze All-Star card was a low pop, I would have said, I don't know. I don't care about that card. It's like a $150 card. If I want one, I'll just get one tomorrow. Well, I should have been smarter. Now, going back to my final statement in all these videos is, what does all this mean, right? Well, like I said, the 58 Topps All-Star cards have increased in price, to me disproportionately, because the pop counts are lower for one of the cards, but not all the cards. And a lot have been submitted. And if you look at how they grew at, especially from 21 to 22, they grew at 133% versus all other years around 22%. And so to me, that's disproportionate and driven really by one card. And again, that exception is the 58 Maze. It's got the lowest pop count of any PSA 8 card from 58 through 62. So in a lot of ways, it is the rarest PSA 8 Topps All-Star card. And I think that gives it some sort of special meaning. There's people who just collect All-Star cards. Now, the thing I'm also going to talk about is the 58 All-Star set is considered by many collectors as being the most attractive. Now, I like the 59 set, but the 58 set does have a lot of color and appeal. And so you combine, let's say, the most visually attractive set with the lowest pop count to one of the best players of all time, to a player whose value is correcting because it's really been well established that he was a better player than Mickey Mantle for his entire career, and possibly one that, maybe the best player of all time outside of Babe Ruth. I think there you go as to why that card has exploded in value. So we have kind of uncorked that card and its meaning. Now, there are cards I think that are due for some price corrections. I think the 61 Willie Mays, which has a pop count of 272, but grew at 240% overall. To me, that is a card I would say I wouldn't really invest in that card. It's got too high of a pop count. It's gone up in value quite a bit. I don't know if that's sustainable. And the other card is the 58 Mantle. So, we saw the Mantle card really, in general, slow down disproportionately to the Mays and Aaron cards during the same time period. So the cooling off for Mantle was much more steep than for the Mays and Aaron cards. But in general, that's true across the board for most Mantle cards right now. Maybe he'll pick back up again as people kind of realize He's still very collectible, and I think people know that. But I just think people kind of were like, besides Mantle, who else is out there to collect, and who is kind of undervalued? And they were putting their money into those undervalued Hall of Famers. And at some point, Mantle will go up again. But this card is not a card that, to me, again, the idea of investment grade, right? Is it an investable card? No. It's too high of a pop count. It's too easy to get. Is it great for collectors who want a cheap Mantle? Yes. Is it great for people who just want a cool looking Mantle card? Yes. For collectors, it's a great card. As an investor card, I would not want to touch it, which I think why you'll see that price correction, because again, when the investors and collectors all go for the same cards, prices spike tremendously. And that's what you saw with the 58 Mays. But you're not going to see that, to me, with the Mantle. And that's why I think that card is due for price correction. Now, the cards that should go up, in my opinion, are the 62 Aaron, when it's ever sold again in 2022. That low pop count, 148, and the fact that it had the lowest increase in terms of total percentage over those 3 years than any other card, from 2020 to 22. And so to me, that shows that that card is due for a massive increase in price. So if I had one, and I don't, unfortunately, I wish I did. I wish I was smart enough to have bought one. But I would stick it in golden. I would just tell Kenny Boy that this card is due for a major price correction. I think All-Star cards are still hot, and this card is a major rarity. It's the second rarest All-Star card from the 50s and 60s, and I think it's going to go up massively, and that card could hit $2,000 or $3,000. The Mantle 62 is hit almost to $3,000, right? At some point. So actually closer to $2,000. But this card could do the similar thing because it's a much lower pop count. And if people are really putting these runs together, if we do think that people are collecting these All-Star cards or collecting Aaron, they need this card. Now, the 59 to me is one that could go up as well. I don't think it'll go up quite as much. But to me, it's a sub 200 PSA pop count, and it grew at only 113%, which is low. So I think it's going to go up, when it sells again, and it's a card that will continue, I think, to climb a little bit higher, but it's not going to be like the 62 Aaron. The 62 Aaron is kind of like the next card, to me. It's got to be because of the low pop count and the fact it hasn't sold yet in 22. So I think that's the one I'm watching for when one pops up. I haven't looked on eBay today to see if one's up. I mean, there could be 5 on eBay tomorrow. Who knows? They're not pop zero, so there is 148 of them out there. But I think it's one to watch, and if you got one, it might be a good time to list it, and maybe you'll hit the jackpot with that card. So there it is, guys. That's my review of the All-Star cards from 58 to 62. Let me know in your comments what you'd like to see me look at next. Is there other years and other cards that you want to look at? I've heard league leaders to look at those cards. The dual cards, like the cards, like the 58 Aaron and Mantle card, what they've been doing over the last 5 years or 3 years. Give me some ideas. I definitely like looking at cards and the values and kind of trying to make sense of it all. But hey, I hope you guys like the video. Hopefully you're enjoying some of my newer content as I talk more directly to you guys and want your feedback. So enjoy the direct conversation. So let me know in the comments what you like, what you don't like, and I'll catch you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.